Hello and welcome to the Logos Research Associates live stream broadcast. I'm Zachary Klein, an ambassador for Logos, and I'll be your host for this evening's program. As we like to remind our viewers, Logos Research Associates is a fellowship of scholars and scientists who are committed to upholding a high view of science and a high view of Scripture. We believe that scholarship, logic, the scientific method can and should be used to show that the Bible's historical claims are credible and ultimately superior to the secular model of origins. Now, as with last month's presentation, we at Logos have been delving into some topics that are areas of active research and even some controversy among fellow creationists. We at Logos agree, as well as all creationists, that the Bible's account of the flood in the days of Noah was a real historic event, an act of God's judgment as well as cleansing from the effects of rampant sin and corruption after the fall of Adam. Creationists are united in the belief that the global flood played the defining role in shaping the geology of our planet, the formation of the fossil record, and shaping of the climate for centuries to come. However, creationists have historically disagreed amongst themselves about exactly which rock layers and which fossils were deposited during the flood itself, as opposed to before the flood and especially the post flood period. Even, even among the major creationist organizations, different views have been held and popularized. And even here at Logos, there are a variety of views held by the associates on the post flood boundary. So, as we continue this conversation today, I think it is important that we recognize two things. First, this is a genuine scientific debate within the creationist community. All the major views are in agreement that Noah's flood was a historic global event and that it reshaped the earth. The disagreement among creationists is over the interpretation of scientific data and over which view better explains that data. Scientific debates are important and they can be very healthy. They help to clarify issues and spur researchers on to do more research. And importantly, these debates remind us that as creationists, we must always hold our scientific beliefs with a looser grip, remaining open to new data, better explanations, and better models, while staying true to the facts described in Scripture. Now, for the second point. As creationists and as Christians, it is our calling to show Christ-likeness in all of our interactions, including our disagreements with one another. It's quite likely that many of our viewers may have strong opinions and different views on tonight's topic. These are important issues. Our view on the flood post flood boundary affects our interpretation of the fossil record, of animal diversity, of the kinds and numbers of animals that were on board the ark, the field of archaeology, and many other topics. Yet, even these important issues pale in comparison to the need for we as creationists to exhibit the love and grace of our Savior in our conduct and in our conversation. In Ephesians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul implored his readers to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love. So may this be our goal as we learn and navigate these important, challenging issues in creation science. With that in mind, and before I introduce our speaker, please join me as we open in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity that we have to gather virtually and to learn more about your creation. Lord, we thank you that you have not left yourself without witness, that through your word and also through your creation, we can see your hand at work in history and in our planet, in our world. We thank you that your word is true and that it is trustworthy. And we thank you for scientists and researchers like our speaker tonight who have put so much effort and to whom you've given insight and opportunities to explore your creation and to help better understand it in light of the truth of your word. I pray that you would give our speaker clarity of thought as he communicates tonight. I pray that everything that is said and done this evening would be to your honor and glory. And we pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen. It is now my privilege to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Tim Clarey. Dr. Clarey received a Master's of Science in Geology from the University of Wyoming and a Master of Science in Hydrogeology from Western Michigan University. His PhD in geology was received in 1996 from Western Michigan University. From 1984 to 1992, Dr. Clarey worked as an exploration geologist at Chevron, USA, developing oil drilling prospects and analyzing assets and lease purchases. He was full professor and geosciences chair at Delta College in Michigan for 17 years before
Mhm.
leaving in 2013 to join the science staff at the Institute for Creation Research, having earlier conducted research with ICR in its FAST program, and he now serves as their director of research. Dr. Clarey has published many books on various aspects of the Rocky Mountains and has authored 2 college laboratory books, in addition to numerous publications in creationist technical literature on the topic of the flood and the geologic record. He's the author of several books, the most recent including Dinosaurs, Marvels of God's Design, and Carved in Stone, which I have here with me, Geologic Evidence of the Worldwide Flood. So, Dr. Clarey, welcome to the broadcast, sir.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here and get a chance to speak to our esteemed colleagues and friends and family members even. But as director of research, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of the other research we're doing at ICR, probably even more important than mine, is that we're working on a new theory of biological design and led by Dr. Randy Galuza, where we're looking at non-random mutations as the way that animals adapt. It's not, it's built in the organism. And so they sense changes and they change because God created them that way internally. And so that's what we're studying with the blind cavefish. So if you're interested, go to icr.org and check out some of the papers we published already on that. And again, we need prayers for that as well. So I wanted to mention that, but tonight we're going to talk about the flood boundaries. And I don't want to, sound like I have all the answers, but there's a lot of data that I'm going to talk about tonight. And I want to go through that data, and I may not be able to convince people if they're, already have their minds made up. But if you've got an open mind, I challenge you to kind of consider some of this data and this information that I'm giving you tonight. I think some of it's pretty powerful. And so we can start on it anytime you want. Anytime you want me to get started, Zach.
Go for it.
So I'll give it a whirl. So let me get this started. Here's the title is Geological Evidence for a High Cenozoic Post-Flood Boundary. I kind of lean towards a boundary that you'll see coming up shortly, maybe a little higher than some, but others I know in the creation community have suggested a higher Cenozoic post-flood boundary as well. Here's kind of the 2 spots that this is the first one that many of our creation brethren will hold to, and that's kind of the KPG, or the old KT boundary, and that shows here. This is the geologic time scale. I know people get confused by all these names we throw out there, so I want to go over this a little bit at the beginning. You can see that all of the fossil-bearing rocks from the Cambrian up to the Ice Age and even today are all part of the Phanerozoic. That's the big eon over there that shows visible life. And then that's broke up into the Paleozoic, which is the earlier, mostly early flood rocks. This is an interpretation from Taz Walker, by the way, which we kind of agree with, at least in my part. And then you see the Mesozoic includes the zone where you find most of your dinosaurs and things like that. And then you get to the Cenozoic above it, which used to be called the Tertiary, but now it's the Paleogene and Neogene. So I may use the Tertiary. I like it better because it includes both. And it coincides with the Tejas mega sequence, which I'll be talking about a little bit later as well. And so the debate is whether the boundary is there at the end of the Cretaceous, is at the end of the flood, and everything above it is post-flood, or is the flood boundary up here, which I lean toward, as you'll see, top of the Pliocene, or very close to the top of the Pliocene, just before the Pleistocene, which is the Ice Age. And so you can see the different times. I'll show this chart one at a time later. And this is from Taz Walker, but I do kind of agree with, he's got a little bit of overlap in a few places because it isn't always immediately clear, is it a really perfectly hard boundary or not? And so the boundary may not be as clear as sometimes I might make it sound, but I do think it's up there near the top of the Pliocene. And what I call the NQ boundary, which is the Neogene-Quaternary. So if you hear me saying Neogene-Quaternary, the top of the Tertiary, again, is called the Neogene. The lower part's the Paleogene. But you almost have to have a chart in front of you to keep track sometimes of. Geologists throw these around a lot. So this is the 2 big boundaries that people normally will talk about, the KPG or the NQ, or the top of the high Cenozoic, whatever you want to call it. There's other people that have other views, but they're not as popular, I guess, for lack of a better word. So I'm going to begin my talk tonight kind of going through 2 major points. I'm going to begin with the discussion of my mega sequence research a little bit, and then a little bit about catastrophic plate tectonics, or CPT, and show that there's a really good match between those 2. I believe that catastrophic plate tectonics is the mechanism that God used to bring on the flood, and as a consequence of that, that's how the making new seafloor helped push water onto the continents. And it's almost a perfect match, in my opinion, of between the mega sequence record on the continents and the production of ocean seafloor. And we'll talk a little bit about that and explain that a little bit better as we go along. The second thing I want to do in the second half of my talk is go through about 13, and I could have listed more. I know Mike Ord has listed a whole bunch more, but at least go through about 12 or 13 additional reasons why I believe the high flood boundary is the correct boundary. So the conventional scientists, or the evolutionary scientists, they believe in 6 mega sequences, or 6 sequences they originally were called. They became mega sequences because the terminology got kind of out of hand. And so even many of the evolutionary geologists use the term mega sequence, but these are the original Sloss sequences by Lawrence Sloss, who developed these in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And he showed that these can be correlated around the world. So I've been using that in the last 10, 11 years to correlate the rocks in North America to all the other continents. And as of today, I finished 6 continents, and we'll see some of that data here shortly. But they believe in 6 floods. They believe here's the first one of North America. This is kind of a paleogeographic map of during the Cambrian, or during the Sauk mega sequence, it's called. And this is the next sequence, and the next sequence, and the next sequence, the next sequence, and finally the last sequence. And so these are the 6 mega sequences. This is their geologic time scale without the years on there. There's the mega sequences on the right-hand side. In the middle is a sea level curve that they've kind of come up with based on their studies, which I think is incomplete. I don't think this is accurate. When I look at the world's geology of the continent, other continents around the world, there's a different story we're going to see in a minute. This is very North American centered. Unfortunately, it's not as global as it makes it sound. And you'll see that the sea level goes up as you go to the left. So down there, number 1, the Sauk mega sequence, which includes the Cambrian, a little bit of the Ordovician. You can see the sea level is supposed to go way up, and it stays way up in the Tippecanoe because it's way off to the left. And that's supposed to be 300 meters above current levels, that sort of thing. And in my charts, I don't put a number. I just kind of do a relative thing, as we'll see. But then they see sea level goes down about to the Upserica mega sequence number 4, and it comes back up to a peak again at the end of the Zuni, which is around the end of the Cretaceous or the KPG, and then it goes down and kind of flops down there to today's levels. So that's their belief. There's 2 big peaks. They think the sea level came up really high, and the first couple of sequences went down and came back up. But mine is going to differ from that, as you'll see, based on the data. In the last 11 years since I joined ICR, I've compiled about 3,200 columns now from 6 different continents. We just finished Australia, and so you'll see some of those, some of that data is put in here as well. I've been keeping track of about 16 different rock types, which there's a lot more than that if you're a geologist, but these are 16 of the most common sedimentary rocks, and even some of the volcanic rocks we're keeping track of in red. We're also keeping track of the mega sequences, and we have the 6 sequences: the Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, Upserica, Zuni, Tejas, which runs the Phanerozoic essentially. And then I'm also keeping track of a pre-Cambrian or possibly a pre-flood mega sequence, but we won't show those too much tonight. But this is kind of how the flood. Yes.
Sorry, just really briefly. Would you be able to click on the hide link there on that tooltip in the bottom center of your screen?
Oh, that says hide. Yeah. I can.
Yeah. Folks were asking to clear. Thank you so much. I'll drop off now.
No. What? Okay. Here. Okay, so here we just talked about what I've been doing, and then here's kind of the result of 5 continents. This is the Sauk, and then this is the Tippecanoe on top of it, Kaskaskia on top of that, and this is the Upserica on top of that, and then the Zuni. And you notice that the coverage is greater and greater, and there's the Tejas finally, which I believe is where the water drained off the continents as they go along. But you'll see there's places in here where there isn't any rocks at all, and those are areas I believe are probably the highest hills. So the Bible talks about the water went 15 cubits over the highest hills. So it didn't leave a lot of sediment behind. So in the 4,500 years since the flood, you have a lot of erosion that took place. And some of those areas didn't have a lot of deposits with only 15 cubits or 23 feet of water. And so there are places in the world, many of them kind of shown in the blue there, the background color, where there are no sediments at all for many of the sequences today. You just have crystalline rock at the surface. Those are the pre-Cambrian shields and that sort of thing. But there's a reason for that. Well, here's what my data has shown compared to the traditional conventional geology timescale we talked about. Or they show their sea level curve goes up and it came down and went back up again. Well, I'm showing basically what those rocks showed. What you just saw was a progressive flood, where the rocks flood a little bit and then they flood a little bit more of the same area, a little bit more of the same area, and then suddenly they jump up in about that 4th mega sequence, the Upserica. They jump up really high, and then you saw a lot more. The maximum coverage was in the Zuni, and so the Zuni to me is still today shows the maximum coverage across the Earth, all 6 continents, and the maximum volume across the Earth in terms of its thickness and volume So it covers both. And so it's amazing how much it is. But second to the Zuni is the Tejas, which is really the tertiary or the most of the Cenozoic below the Ice Age. So to me, that's very, very significant. But we see kind of a progressive flood, minimal, more, peaking in the Zuni. And so here's the interpretation I'm going to present tonight is basically have the rising phase of the flood, started out kind of slow, just burying marine critters, shallow seas for a while. Then you finally hit the land above the Upserica when coal shows up all over. And then we get into the water peaking near the top where the dinosaurs are wiped out, and then the water went down. And those are represented by the Cenozoic or by the post-KPG rocks. So let's look at some of the data. Here's our interpretation of the pre-flood world that we put forth back in 2018, before we had the whole world done, but it's still roughly about that. So it's kind of a Pangea world with a couple of maybe waterways in between a few locations, a small sea here and there. But you can see kind of North America kind of in the center, a little bit off to the left. And then you got Africa and South America kind of right in the center, and kind of the whole Gondwana. And I believe it was Pangea, not Rodinia, for reasons of you can't make ocean crust twice. So you can only destroy the ocean once. So once you destroy it, everything stops. We'll talk about it a little bit later. So that's another whole topic that if you want to look up more, there's some papers we've written on that as well. But the Earth is the only planet with plates. I just saw another paper today that came out just a few weeks ago, still trying to sort out, the conventional geologists, evolutionists are still trying to sort out when did plate tectonics begin and why is the Earth the only planet with plates. And I believe that's because that's the mechanism that God used to crack open the Earth in Genesis 7:11, where the Bible tells us that the fountains of the deep burst all over the Earth. Essentially, that's, I think you began these, what was possibly a solid Earth. They had these plates that just cracked open, and once they cracked open, then they started to move. And again, John Baumgartner has modeled this since the 80s. He's done some really good research back from 1994. He's kind of taken a Pangea-like world, and he's subducted in those blue areas or the subduction zones. He's gone through his iterations and his really sophisticated computer models that really showed us that runaway subduction or rapid plate tectonics, rapid plate movement is a real possibility. And it's been verified, as we'll see in a minute, by some findings in the last 20 years. So he was ahead of the game. He started working on this in the 80s, and he really showed up, which I believe is the mechanism that God used to bring on the flood. And it ultimately helped bring on the Ice Age afterwards as well, but that's another topic. So here's what subduction today looks like. You're moving, the plates moving just a few centimeters per year, maybe a couple inches per year at the most in most of the fastest moving plates. But during the flood year, of course, he modeled that you'd be having plates moving several meters per second, and so a much, much higher rate. And he showed that how it would happen is the way the Earth would weaken as these plates started going down into the Earth. They would weaken and drop in almost like a weight in water. And so we still see this today. You can look at these deep images they're shooting now called seismic tomography. There's one I grabbed for the world. It kind of shows a plate that comes down from the surface. That blue line that we see coming down kind of on an angle from the surface, that's a subducted plate. You can see how it kind of goes down, almost makes like a spaghetti noodle at the bottom sitting on top of the core. And what Dr. Baumgartner and others of us have pointed out is the densities of these subducted plates still look as dense as the stuff at the surface, which implies they're just as cold as the stuff near the surface. So there is geophysical evidence, and this is part of it, that shows that these plates went down into the Earth very, very quickly in the not so distant past. And so just thousands of years ago, these big, thick, 60-mile thick plates actually went down, were pulled down the Earth, and you can see they kind of clumped up in place on the bottom of the core. So I believe that catastrophic plate tectonics, the runaway subduction, whatever you want to call it, is the best mechanism we have today for the flood. It seems to answer the most questions. There's still people that say, no, it's too evolutionary, but the data seems to really support that there was plate movement that took place very rapidly during the flood year. And in the process, it, of course, created a lot of tsunamis. And sometimes we call these tsunami-like waves. But when you start moving plates, you're going to start making tsunamis. And this is the one in Japan a few years ago. That's actually a seawall, so we're kind of cheating here. The wave didn't look like it's going over a seawall, but there are these big, massive waves. And during the flood year, there's indications in some of the cross-bedded sands that these waves might have been as high as 500 feet high tsunamis. So today's tsunamis are 30, 40 feet, maybe 50 feet. And those types of tsunamis can kill hundreds of thousands of people if they're in the coastal areas. But during the flood, these things would have been much, much bigger. And the way it kind of works is the reason plate tectonics helps explain the flood is because the more seafloor you made, the more the seafloor is inflated and pushes up. Just like the ridges today are inflated, but if you have the whole seafloor going up, the whole seafloor rises from the bottom like your bathtub is coming up from the bottom. The water has nowhere to go. It doesn't really compress, and so it just goes higher and gets pushed higher. So the tsunami waves that started coming in slow during these first three sequences, the Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, you see my sea level curve doesn't shift very far to the left. They just kind of come up and goes down, comes up. And there's thousands of iterations in between. This is just a generalization of what I see the rocks are reflecting. But there's a lot of more complexities in there. But in this rising phase, this is the Sauk mega sequence across 6 continents, the way we envision the world might have looked at the beginning of the flood. And so here's the continents basically back into the Pangea mode with a little bit of modifications here and there. But you see very little flooding across South America, very little flooding across Canada, very little flooding across most of what's Africa. And Antarctica, we're not sure about because it's really hard to tell. We're going to see what we can do. But there's a lot of flooding. If we put this back, you can see the whole world. You really don't see a lot of flooding. And then the next sequence shows almost the same thing right on top of that previous sequence. And just there it is again, maybe a little bit less. And so the Tippecanoe sequence actually has a little less volume, a little less coverage today. And so where we see the coverage is in the blue. And if it gets really thick, the colors change. And so where there's no Tippecanoe, for example, the map's still white. And so, but this is what's there today. After all the erosion of the flood, after the flood, the erosion of mountains going up, this is what's still there today. So that's all I'm mapping out is what's still there today in all these maps. But you can see it doesn't change a whole lot in terms of where it covers. Most of Africa is still high and dry. A little bit more of South America maybe, but there's even less coverage in the Tippecanoe. So on my graph, I have the water level going down a little bit, coming up, but not as high as the previous one by just a little bit. Then you look at the Kaskaskia, you think you might have blinked. It didn't change much. Some of this in Europe gets some more coverage, but again, most of Africa is still high and dry. Most of Canada is still high and dry. There's big parts of Asia and Europe, they're still high and dry at this point, Scandinavia. So at this point, all we find in the rock record is mostly marine fossils. And it's not a coincidence that that's only flooding marine fossils. I believe you're only flooding shallow seas at this point. And it's because you weren't making a lot of seafloor at this point. Runaway subduction was just beginning. Maybe it wasn't as extensive as it got later. I'm not really sure why, but you don't see a lot of water being pushed onto the land, only kind of washing across areas that were already underwater, probably in the pre-flood world. So then what happens when you get to the next sequence, by the time you get to the Upserica sequence, that's when you really start to make ocean crust in earnest, as I call it. And everything you see on here, this is the ocean crust age map. Of course, they use millions of years if you look these up, but the red is the youngest down the ridges, like the Middle Atlantic and the East Pacific Rise. There's a ridge across the Indian Ocean, the Indian Ridge. There's a ridge across the Arctic Ocean. Every ocean has a ridge because that's what made the ocean. That's what made that new seafloor. And that happened during the flood year. The Pacific Ocean spread faster for some reason than the Atlantic. So it's wider. You can see the color bands are wider, but that's really what happened. The oldest stuff is the blues up against North America and Africa. The oldest crust, you could argue maybe in the Mediterranean, which isn't shown on here, goes back to the Triassic. That's the Upserica. That's part of that fourth sequence. So the oldest ocean crust we have today in the oceans only goes back to that fourth mega sequence, the Upserica mega sequence. The first three, whatever was made early, didn't last. And it was either destroyed through some sort of subduction process and or metamorphism or smeared on as these ophiolites or something along that line. But again, don't worry about all the details, but it's very significant to know that almost all the world's oceans floor formed from that fourth sequence on. And so if you're making a lot of ocean crust, you're going to push a lot more of the ocean up. And so when the continents split, here's what happened even later in the Zuni, you split across North America, or it already split from Africa, but South America and Africa split there. But here's the basic idea I tried to allude to earlier is the ridges are there today, but the whole bottom of the seafloor was pushed up. As you make new crust, it's still hot. Hot things like a hot air balloon will rise. And so the whole bottom of the seafloor, as you made new crust, goes higher and higher and higher. I think Andrew Snelling calculated one time, if you make a whole new seafloor, you can push the water level of the ocean about a mile, I think it was, a mile higher than it is. And so I believe that's the main mechanism that was used by God to flood the world. You didn't have these big high 26,000 foot high peaks in the pre-flood world. You had some sort of high hills. How high they were, it's not clear, but I don't believe they're anywhere near what we see in the mountains today. Those are all a consequence of the kind of equilibration after a lot of plate movement was taking place. So you push up the whole bottom of the seafloor, and the water's got to go somewhere. So the tsunami waves that started out just covering these shallow seas, burying marine animals, suddenly start to hit the coast. They start to hit plants. They start to hit land animals, and you see the tsunami waves coming in like this, just like it happens today, but much, much bigger than even this. But they start to impact the land. We know by day 40 or shortly thereafter, the Bible tells us the ark was floating. So we know you're impacting the land if the ark starts to float by day 40. So by day 40, you have to be not just flooding shallow seas, but flooding the land. So you should expect to see coal seams show up, buried plant material, and land animals. And that's exactly what we see. We see the first appearance of extensive coal beds all over the world at the same time, pretty much in the Upserica. In that, there's a few before that, but they're really extensive when you get to what's called the Pennsylvanian or Upper Carboniferous all over the world. And that's the beginning of the Upserica megasequence. So here the water is suddenly pushed up much higher because you're making more seafloor. So remember, with more seafloor, the water goes higher. Until that ocean seafloor cooled, as the flood water stopped making it, eventually that ocean crust sank, and that helped draw the water off the land as well. You also see the first extensive amounts of land animals in addition to the coal, and you see these marine reptiles being washed onto the land as well, marine animals being washed onto the land because those waves are bringing everything in. So it's not a surprise that we see a land and marine mix. And we see that throughout the rest of the flood record, all the way up through even the Cenozoic or the chaos. So here's kind of a study that Nate Jensen did for me many years ago when he worked for ICR. He looked at the paleobiology database and plotted up about 8 or 10 phyla of animals, and he plotted up which ones are marine, which ones are land, and he showed that almost everything between the sock, Tippecanoe, and Kaskaskia, those first three sequences, it's almost 100% marine fossils. There's a few that aren't, but it's 99.9% marine. Above that, we see the red coming in. That's the Carboniferous. That's the Upper Carboniferous. That's the Upserica megasequence up through the Zuni. And then above that, we have the Tejas. But you always see aquatic animals mixed in. But you see an increasing amount of red. That's the land animals. But there is a reason why they show up suddenly, because you're now flooding the land. So here's the Upserica. You see how the water level in my diagrammatic chart goes up dramatically compared to what it was before. Shifts more to the left. And so I believe that when you look at that, here's the world map of when you start to see the continents separating here. North America is now split away from Africa, and it's starting to break up a little bit because you're making that new seafloor. You're making a lot more ocean crust, making the Atlantic Ocean starting to split apart. And because of that, you're pushing the water higher, so the waves went higher. So now you start to flood the land here at this point in the flood year. And then that process continues. You keep making more ocean seafloor. You're pushing the water higher, and the water goes over the top. So you reach the highest sea level, which agrees with one of the highest sea levels even in the evolutionary curve. They just think there's an earlier one, which I see there really is no evidence for that earlier one. As the rocks show, there's just a minimal flooding early, and then it gets higher and higher as you go along. It's a truly progressive flood, which matches perfectly with runaway subduction or rapid plate tectonics or catastrophic plate tectonics. To me, it's a wonderful match between what John Baumgartner predicted, what the seismic tomography shows really did happen really quickly because those slabs are still cold deep in the earth, and then the match with the progressive flooding of the continents that I see in the rock record as I study each continent. So here's the Zuni, and now you're separating. We just picked a point in the Zuni, I think in the Cretaceous, where you're split across Africa and South America. You're starting to see the continents kind of broke apart. You still see India is way down there. It hasn't come anywhere near Asia. And so at the end of the KPG, about the KPG time, end of the Zuni, you still have India a long way from running into Asia. And so there's a lot of things that still hadn't happened yet when you end at the KPG level. That's one of my arguments against that being the end of the flood, as we'll see here in just a moment. But this is the maximum coverage. And you see there's a few little dots up near Hudson Bay, a couple little blue dots you can barely make out, a couple of dots across Michigan and Illinois. Those are remnants of the water that went over the top. And so you see a lot of little dots here and there. But those dots are significant because those had to be brought in from the edges. They can't just have a drop of sediment show up from a drone or something like that. These had to wash in from the sides. And so even though, critics will say, well, how come we don't see sediments everywhere? Well, again, going back to the Bible, it explains 15 cubits over the highest hills is not really that much water, and you can't leave that much sediment behind. So you've left a little bit of sediment. There's a few remnants, which I call the bathtub ring. And you can see it went over the top of Canada. But physically, the rocks are gone today. They eroded away. a little bit was deposited. But it's still amazing how the Zuni still shows the maximum surface coverage of all these sequences and the maximum volume. And so here's finally the Tejas, which I believe is the receding phase of the flood. You reach the peak and now you're going down. And this lasted over half a year, if you look at the biblical timeline. So it's even though it's short on this diagram, it's because there's not many names. But this is the Tejas mega sequence, and this is, again, we're now pretty much in today's configurations, a little bit shy of it, I think. But those bright green areas are really thick. And so the Gulf of Mexico got really thick. Off the Niger Delta got thick. Off the Bay of Bengal got thick. South China Sea, those areas got really thick where it's kind of a green color. But where it's white, there isn't any. And so that was very similar. This is second only to the Zuni in terms of its surface coverage, in terms of its volume. And it's a significant amount of volume, as we'll talk about a little later. So here's kind of a summary of the 5 continents, again, showing what I showed earlier, the stacking of these sequences as they go along. And they just get more and more and more each time. The coverage increases upward because you're pushing more water up. As the new seafloor is being created, you're pushing the water higher and higher. And it kind of, here's a little bit more of a cross section. Here's the sock coming in. There's obviously, there's a suasion going on. The Bible talks about waves coming in and backing off, waves coming in and backing off. But essentially, I believe you were rising for the first 5 sequences, reaching a peak in the Zuni, which is around the KPG boundary, and then the water reversed direction. And that reverse in direction was very high energy. And that's what transported things like offshore, like the Whopper Sand we'll talk about a little later. But I mentioned this earlier, but I believe it's almost a perfect match. I mean, nothing's perfect in science. Let's be realistic here. But it's a really, really good match of catastrophic plate tectonics to the progressive advance of the mega sequences across the continent. So the rocks I've been studying for the last 11 years really reflect a progressive flood on every continent, because it was a progressive push from below. As you made more seafloor, you're pushing the water up. And there must have been surges how it did it. That's something that needs to be studied, is how come it makes these some individual rises and comes down, rises and comes down. These large packages of sedimentation we call mega sequences. Why do they rise and then can drop back a little bit and rise and keep coming back and forth? And that probably relates to surges in plate tectonic, movement rates and how fast it was creating new seafloor. But that needs to be studied more by the geophysicists. So the bottom line is down there in white: more new seafloor equals higher water levels. And so in the Absarica, the 4th sequence, you started making tremendous amount of seafloor that continued through the Zuni. And it continued through the Tejas. So this is our first point of the 12 or 13 I want to get over, is about 1/2 of the ocean seafloor was created during the Tejas deposition, during the post-KPG. All the yellow, orange, and red you see in this map are after the KPG. So you see a tremendous amount of the ocean. And John Baumgartner has talked about this for about 30 years. He said that you got too much seafloor being made, too much of the mechanism of the flood was still humming along after the KPG to end the flood. And that's been an argument that I feel strongly about as well. If CPT, or catastrophic plate tectonics, is the mechanism of the flood, how do you say the flood is over when you still haven't made half the ocean that's going to be made during the flood year? You're still going to have these massive earthquakes. It's still going to have these massive tsunami waves being pushed higher and higher and higher. Even when the water is going down, the Bible talks about the assuasion, because you still have tsunami waves being generated, tsunamis still being generated. And even though the net result was the water was dropping, enough seafloor was cooling in those areas way off in the Pacific where it's blue on this map that you actually had a net drop in sea level, even though you're making a lot more seafloor still. So the question is, how can you stop it? And that's what John Baumgartner said in his presentation last summer. He said there's simply no way to square the basic physics of CPT with the proposition that the seafloor spreading responsible for half the present-day seafloor occurred after the flood. He said, if you look at this, is the global picture. This is the mechanism of the flood. The way it works is it pushed water onto the continents progressively, as I'm showing in my sedimentation. So in other words, John says, the end of the flood logically cannot have been prior to the production of this vast amount of new seafloor. And so this is probably our strongest point. This is the global picture of the ocean's seafloor, and it matches with what we see pushing water into the continents. How do you say the flood is over at the KPG when it was still making half the world's ocean floor? And then John went a little bit further this last summer. He looked at a bunch of seamounts, and he showed the tops of these seamounts are sheared off, which get sheared off these kind of sunken volcanoes all around the ocean. There's over 100 of these, He talked about this particular one, which has been dated as late Miocene. So here we are way up in the top of the Tejas, the top of the Paleo, or the Neogene, even the upper part of the what used to be called the Tertiary, and you're still seeing that there's tsunami waves still zipping across, still eroding the tops of these down. So when did the intense tsunami activity cease? Well, it didn't cease until you stop making seafloor, and that's pretty much around the Pliocene. So the very high Cenozoic boundary is reflected by the stop in seafloor spreading. So today, once all the ocean crust was consumed, the original ocean crust that was probably colder, once that was consumed by the Earth's mantle, that colder stuff was more dense. Once that was gone, all you had was hot seafloor left. And hot seafloor is more buoyant, it doesn't want to sink. So all of a sudden the whole world just stopped, came to a screeching halt literally. And now you just have plates moving just a couple centimeters per year. But the reason it all stopped is because you ran out of original seafloor. All we have was the new seafloor, as I pointed out earlier, that was created since the Upserica mega sequence and up to today. So, but there's no indications it was slowing down, no indications of any of it, no indications the tsunamis were stopping. John Baumgartner looked at a bunch of these seamounts, and he showed that they're all sheared off, even these ones that are very, very young in terms of the geologic column, if you want to call it that. And my other point that I made at this last number was there's a tremendous amount, and I've alluded to this a little earlier, tremendous amount, second only to the Zuni, which is, I believe, the high point of the flood because of its maximum coverage and maximum volume. But the Tejas is second in terms of its surface area coverage. And in terms of its volume, it's 32.5% of the Phanerozoic rocks. So that includes all these mega sequences. If you add up the volume in just the Tejas, you're looking at almost 33% of the rock record. Now, since I finished Australia, it's dropped a little bit. Australia chipped the scales down a little bit. So the real number I found out just the other day, did the math, was instead of 32.5, I now got to change my next paper to say 31.7. And so when you add Australia into the mix, it doesn't really change much, but it kind of moves the numbers around a little bit. It's still second only to the Zuni. The Zuni is still the most volume you can see there, and the most surface coverage, and it's also dropped to 31.7% of the rock record. This even shows the pre-Sauk. And so I didn't include that in this calculation, but from the Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, Upserica, Zuni, everything from the Cambrian, so to speak, on up, it's still almost 32%. That's a tremendous amount of sediment. And it's not just offshore. People have said, well, it's all offshore. Well, a lot of it is, but there's a lot of it onshore as well. You look across Africa, there's a bunch of remnants in the middle of Africa. You look across Australia, there's a bunch in Australia. There's some across the Amazon region, and the Rockies particularly. All around the Rockies, you have thousands and thousands of feet of Tejas sediments, stuff above the KPG. So it's not just offshore. And these are very, very extensive layers, and I'll show you an example of one at the end of my talk that covers parts of 8 different states in the United States alone. So these are massive deposits. To make massive deposits, you have to have massive waves, which I believe still has to be part of the global flood. So the Tejas, again, number one, the mechanism of the flood, if it is CPT, was still humming right along. You made over half or at least half the ocean crust was made after the KPG. So the mechanism of the flood, making the tsunamis, making the waves, making all this activity, to me, it's almost unimaginable that any animal could live on Earth when that was still going on, because that was still part of the flood. And then you have the sedimentation that we see, continuous sedimentation across big chunks of all the continents. Admittedly, a lot of it is offshore because a lot of it was washing offshore. And the very high energy deposits going offshore, and one of the first things we see in the Gulf of Mexico is called the Whopper Sand. Here we have a sand that covers almost the entire Gulf of Mexico. But about 200 miles offshore, suddenly it gets to be over 1,000 foot thick. In some places, it's almost 2,000 foot thick. It's almost a pure sand. I think there's one shale party in the middle. It's a flat bottom and a flat top. There's no indication of any transition. It's just boom, like you dumped this huge, massive pile of sand out in the Gulf of Mexico. And I believe that's part of the receding phase of the flood. This is the very bottom, the bottommost layer of the Tejas, which I believe is the receding phase. So when you have water flowing off a parking lot, you're going to have a lot of energy flowing off. And the first thing, once the water comes on and then changes direction, it's going to have a tremendous amount of energy to push that material all the way hundreds of miles offshore. The oil company I worked for, the chief geologist for Chevron, came by to see me when I was presenting some of this at an oil and gas conference a few years ago. And I reminded them that they wouldn't let us look for sand beyond 100 miles offshore. There's no conventional model to get sand beyond 100 miles. They would have to have little rivers and things dumping sand out there. They have no mechanism for massive movements of water like we have for the flood. And so they had no idea it was out there. And I talked to him and he goes, well, yeah, we were wrong. He flat out admitted they were wrong. But they still have no mechanism to get this out there other than the receding phase of the flood, the very beginning of the receding phase. And we see sands all over the earth. It's not just there. I'll show you a map later. There's sands all over at this same level because of the high energy reversible flow from the advancing water to suddenly changing direction and going offshore. And so the Whopper Sand, to me, can't be explained as a local catastrophe. It can't be explained as anything else other than a flood deposit when the water shifted directions. At least I haven't heard any explanation other than that. Even the evolutionary explanations are pretty far-fetched, where they have to say the ocean floor dropped 6,000 feet, or the water level dropped 6,000 feet in the Gulf of Mexico. But if you drop the water level 6,000 feet in the Gulf of Mexico, it's going to have to drop 6,000 feet everywhere. And there's no indications that happened anywhere in the post-KPG time, even in their worldview of millions and millions of years. So they're struggling trying to explain that, but I think the flood explains it best. Okay, fourth point is the thickest and most extensive coal seams. Some people have argued there may be thicker ones in some places in Pennsylvania. So let's just say some of the thickest and most extensive coal seams in the world occur in the Tejas, and in our own backyard in Wyoming. If you get out there to the area around Gillette, Wyoming, in the Powder River Basin, you'll see coals, and this is a picture of one of those that's in some places up to 60 meters thick, 200 feet thick. And they go 100 miles, 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. They're not just a sinuous layer from rivers. These are huge, massive deposits that are stacked one on top of the other. And so you see these massive coals. They mine the closest ones, of course. Many of them they just find by drilling wells, and they can line these up and they can correlate them across large portions of the Powder River Basin. But that's just part of it. They're also around the world. Here's some of the stacked ones in the Powder River area up in northeast Wyoming and southern Montana. You can see there's not just one coal seam in black. You see there's several of them, and some of them are extremely thick, up to 80 to 100 feet is common, and others are up to 200 foot thick. And still we produce, I think, over 42% of the United States' coal production comes from the Powder River Basin alone because the coal seams are so thick. And they're kind of a low sulfur coal as well, which helps with the acid rain, helps the environment by burning cleaner coal. All right, number 5, along that same line, there's also massive coal deposits offshore in the Tejas, above the KPG again. So here we see coal off of Siberia. The oil wells are drilled into in the middle. And if you look to the left, you see it off Malaysia and off of south of Vietnam and east of Vietnam. There's all these wells that drilled into these massive coal deposits. Some of these are a couple hundred kilometers off Borneo, and they're 1.5 kilometers thick, so they're close to a mile thick. And they're in the Oligocene section, which is near the middle of the Cenozoic, the middle of the Tejas. And today they're in over 1,000 meters of water, so they're below 3,000 feet of water. The evolutionary scientists can't explain these. They can't explain because they think coal forms in place, so there must have been. And there's no evidence of any continental crust in most of these areas. These are offshore on what's now continental, on ocean crust. So they're baffled. They don't bring these up when they talk about coal and coal environments because they have no way to explain these, nor do they have any way to explain 80 and 200-foot coal seams that we see exposed in Wyoming. So these are creationists' best friend, these coal seams. But to me, this is difficult to explain if you are trying to say these are from local catastrophes after the flood is over. How do you get all this coal out there? How do you wash this coal out there that far out? And again, it's not just a single layer, it's several layers stacked on top of each other, just like we see onshore, we see offshore. And most recently, I found in the Gippsland Basin, I believe, between Australia and Tasmania, you see the same thing, all this Tejas coal that's washed offshore. And so I believe these are some of the trees that were on the highest hills. As the water went over the top again, above the KPG, and went over the highest hills, which are now the shield areas that washed off all these trees, and it transported these trees offshore. These trees are different than the earlier coals we saw, the so-called Pennsylvania or Carboniferous coals, which are more lycopod coals. These are more like metasequoias and higher, more rich in flowering plants, which show up, in the higher rock levels, most of them, because that was the highest elevations being flooded and being stripped off. So when you think about ecological zonation, there's even ecological zonation in the plant fossils as you go upward, and it matches what we see with the animal fossils and the reason why dinosaurs disappear at a certain level. It's not an extinction. That's just where their ecosystem is totally gone, and it goes to the next ecosystem above it. And that's why we see these sudden changes. So the KPG marks the big ecosystem change. I don't believe it's the end of the flood. It's near the high point of the flood. So again, these coal seams are not insignificant. And to get them out there, I can't imagine any local catastrophe to put coal this extensive that far offshore, just like the Whopper Sand. Too extensive, too much sand for a local catastrophe to do that. Only the flood can do these types of deposits. Number 5, we have thick areas of tejas sedimentation. Particularly, there's one I found in the South Caspian Basin in the Caspian Sea, where we have 17 kilometers of tejas or post-KPG sedimentation. And it's mostly marine shale and marine limestone, marine carbonate rocks. And if the KPG people are correct, all this would have had to occur in about 100, 200 years prior to the Ice Age. So the flood ends, and then you have maybe 100, 200 years before the Ice Age really kicks on as a true Ice Age. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there's not a lot of time for all these sediments to be deposited if they're post-flood. But if they're part of the receding phase of the flood, you've got a half a year of just washing material in, mountains coming up, and sediments being washed in. It's a little more understandable, able to grasp that. And they're also filled with marine algae. Some of these shales are the source rocks for oil production in the South Caspian Basin as well. But you're looking at a tremendous amount. And there's other places like the Hanna Basin in Wyoming, thousands and thousands of feet of tejas. Even the Green River Formation, thousands of feet of tejas or post-KPG sediments. Just extensive across huge areas of the state of Wyoming. Just like we see, here's a little map of the South Caspian Sea, where they drilled that deepest well. If you calculate this out to 200 years after the flood to deposit all the sediment, you would have to deposit about 20 feet per month to build that 17 kilometers or 6.25 meters per month. How do you live when there's that much sedimentation going on? How does any animal live when all that's going on? And why would you get off the ark if that was still going on? To me, it's almost unfathomable to have this much sedimentation post-flood. This is all, I believe, part of the flood, the receding phase. And I mentioned earlier, the Whopper Sand, you see all the yellow in the Gulf of Mexico. In this map, this is the bottommost layer of the tejas, right on top of the KPG. And you see all around Asia, it's pretty much all sand. All around North America, there's a lot of sand. Across South America, even onshore. Even onshore in North America, around the Rockies, it's all sand. So there's very high energy sand deposits, not only washed offshore, but we're spreading all around the continents as well. But notice in the North Africa area, and the north half of Australia, and even in the Caribbean area, you see a lot of blue. That's limestone. So those areas during the immediate post-KPG, in the earliest tejas, was all being deposited by water. You see salt deposits in the Red Sea. That pink is salt deposits that are 10,000 feet thick in some places. All this stuff was happening. But again, where the ark landed is over somewhere near Turkey. Exactly where, people can debate that. Whether it's the mountains of Ararat, it's not just Mount Ararat. I believe it's a little bit west of Mount Ararat, but that's beside the point. It's in that region. But that whole region is not, you're still having deposition of marine rocks. And I'll look into more details there. Here's the secular map about the same time. You see where I see the blue here across North Africa and the Middle East and Southern Europe and around Africa, and even in Australia, you see the same thing here. You see they still show what they interpret as the Eocene, which is the lower part of the tejas, right above the KPG, not too far above the KPG. They still show a lot of Europe flooded, a lot of Middle East flooded. And so it isn't just me. I mean, this is what the data shows. And this is what they show based on that data. And I believe my data set's probably even better than what they had. They didn't go back and plot up 3,200 cores and columns. You can see the data here. And so zooming in a little bit on Turkey, I kind of put a black circle around Turkey. You can see some of Turkey is barren. There's no tejas there because it was later uplift of some of the mountains in Turkey stripped it away. But you can still see south of Turkey and even across north of Turkey into Europe and places, and across the Mediterranean. All the area is still blue. That's still limestone deposition. That's still marine deposits. So you've got limestone, you've got thick salt deposits, and marine sands, because they find marine fossils in them and glauconite and minerals that are indicative of marine sands across much of Europe and this whole North Africa, whole Middle Eastern region. So the region where the arc lands, it makes it very difficult to get off the arc if it's still underwater. From the Cretaceous, there's limestone of the Cretaceous all the way up to almost to the Miocene and even the Pliocene, across Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and much of Europe. And here's a few cross sections I drew, because some of you wonder, well, where's the marine rocks go? Well, there's a little blue line there. So I flattened these on the KPG. And everything above that flat line, that lighter color stuff, that's the Cenozoic, or the Tejas, whatever you want to call it. So this is cross section 8A prime, which runs from almost the Netherlands all the way across to Turkey. And so on the left side is the Netherlands, and on the right is Turkey and other countries in between. But you see there's a lot of marine deposition all the way across Europe, from the Netherlands all the way across. Most of the Cenozoic is still marine. There's salt in Turkey way up there towards the top of the Cenozoic. There's sandstones and shales and limestones being deposited, all indicative of marine deposits. And we can look at another cross section that kind of goes more north-south, right across Turkey and into Syria and Iraq, where the Mammal presumably was built somewhere in this region. We see again blues, which represents limestone. The pinks represent salts. And we see that little thin blue line where you see much of the Cenozoic again, except for that one tall column, the second column from the right, in Azerbaijan. There's too many new countries, I can't keep up. But in that column, you have about half marine, half non-marine. But the rest of them, it's 90% or more is marine. And these are several thousand meters in some places of marine across all of Syria and all of Iraq. So my question is, how do you get off the arc when this whole area is still being inundated, still flooded by water? And my colleague Jeff Tompkins looked at the Hebrew on that and studied the Hebrew extensively around Genesis 8:13 and 8:14. And it says, Noah looked out, the earth was dry. And he says it's a perfect verb showing that process was done. The process was completed, so the earth was dry. And he looked out again before. And then he waited another 60-some days for vegetation to grow, presumably. And then God let him off the ark. But then again, the Bible tells us the earth was dry. So the earth was dry before they got off the ark. The earth was dry when they got off the ark. There wasn't this extensive water. How would you get off the ark if it's still depositing limestone all around the ark? And so I believe that was another strong indicator that that's the receding phase of the flood. Again, these are the rocks. The rocks tell the story. It's just a matter of pulling up these cores, looking at the oil wells drilled in these areas, plotting them up and seeing what they see. But they really do show all of this. We go back and we can see this whole region in blue was still underwater after the KPG, all the way up to the top of the Cenozoic in many places. So how do you get off the ark? How do you land here? Why would you land here if this area was still wet, even if you want to go that road and say maybe it was wet here, not everywhere? Why would the ark land in this region then? Why wouldn't it land somewhere where it dried earlier? But again, the ark landed in this area where it's still deposition from the KPG all the way up to the top of the Miocene, top of the Pliocene, which is almost near the NQ boundary. So to me, that's another strong evidence. One of the stronger evidences, again, continuous deposition of marine rocks from the KPG all the way up, all across that region, but other regions as well. Half of Australia was still being flooded. It was still blue, still limestone being deposited. So there were major areas of the world that were still definitely underwater, even at the start and throughout much of the Tejas, or the Cenozoic, or the Paleogene, Neogene. Again, I'm sorry for the names, but even geologists confuse ourselves because we keep renaming things. But this is a graph that shows there should be a lot more canyons. If the water drained off at the KPG, why aren't there canyons like this one we kind of diagrammatically whipped up? Major canyons all over the world. They all begin, not here. They don't begin at the Cretaceous. They begin up at wherever rocks are at the surface. They begin above that. They begin up the top of the Tejas. And so Denman Canyon in Antarctica, for example, and the Grand Canyon of Greenland, both of these begin in the Upper Cenozoic rocks. We don't see evidence of canyons where the water drained off the continents at the end of the Cretaceous. We just see continuous deposition almost from the Cretaceous to the Paleogene and Neogene. That's why you can find the KT boundary. There's no erosion. It just stops there, and the next rock layers are deposited. Now, it's a major change in rock type sometimes, and a major change in fossils because I believe you're reached an ecological zone where you wiped out a whole ecosystem worldwide, and now you're on to the next one. So there are some big changes, but you don't see evidence of major erosion at that level that you'd expect. And we say that to the evolutionists all the time. We always argue, between the red wall limestone and then we'll have limestone below it. We see supposedly 160 million years of time, yet we see perfectly flat layers because we realize that's just deposition brick upon brick. Well, the same thing is true pretty much worldwide with the Cretaceous into the Tejas or into the Tertiary or whatever you want to call it, Paleogene, Neogene. We see continuous deposition. There's no evidence of massive erosion. So again, arguing that the flood wasn't over. And then the mammals, most of the world's large mammals anyway. We do have some mammals in the Mesozoic with the dinosaurs, squirrel-like animals, and Tasmanian devil-like animals and things that lived in more wetland areas, lowland areas. But all these animals that we're more familiar with, like cows and horses and lions and tigers and bears, they all show up above the KPG. So why weren't these buried in the flood? And I believe they were. This is part of the flood. This is above the KPG. There's nothing magical about the KPG. It's just where an ecosystem was wiped out and you changed different animals. So now you're flooding the highest elevations. And you're washing in the angiosperms that live at the highest elevations. You're washing in the animals that live at the highest elevations. And you're spreading them all over. There's a lemur. That's the same lemur has been found in Wyoming, is up in the islands of northernmost Canada, right near the tip of Greenland. Same lemur. They were spread both ways from Canada as the water went over the top. So there's a lot of spreading of all these animals all over the world as the water went over the top. And these are the animals put on top of the dinosaurs. But the question is, where did these things come from? Why do we have certain animals suddenly showing up in the Oligocene or the Miocene or even the Eocene? Why weren't these buried in the flood? And that's been a question a lot of people have asked. And I think this flood model explains it. This is all part of the receding phase where you washed the highest hills over the top, and these are some of the animals that lived in those highest hills. And keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, you only have about 100 to 200 years between the post-flood and the ice age. You only have about 1 to 200 years between all the deposition of all that Tejas, if you believe the KPG is the end of the flood, and all that Tejas being deposited. So you don't have a lot of time for animals to suddenly show up and exactly how they did it. People have suggested different ideas. A lot of people are very quiet about that. They don't really explain what the animals showed up. Why suddenly do you see camels? Why suddenly do you see horses? Where did these things come from if they weren't in the flood? And you got to wonder, here's just a couple of pictures of some of these evolutionary drawings of some of the animals they find in the Tejas. Not only do we find all of our whales in the Eocene above rocks, we don't find any whales below that. We also find all these large elephant-looking things. All these types of animals all show up for the first time in the Tejas. And so where do they all come from if they weren't part of the flood? Did they evolve after the arc somehow? Did they go through the saltation? Some people have suggested rapid evolution. Whales walked off the arc, that sort of thing. Here's the whale fossils based on the paleobiology database. You look at Europe, is covered with whale fossils. And then every coastal area pretty much around the world, as the water went over the top and kind of washed back, some of the water left behind some of what was in the water, and some of these whales suddenly show up. So some people have suggested this, like the evolutionists, that whales walked. But you have to do all this in 200 years or less based on the biblical timeline. So when the flood ends and the ice age comes on, if you want to argue that's all the Cenozoic or the Tejas, whether you believe the Tejas is a mega sequence or not, which I believe it is, you still have to explain, where did all these animals come from? And why do you suddenly have all these new types of animals and plants showing up? And the next question I've asked is, how do the animals disperse? This is what the world probably looked like at the end of the flood. Notice a lot of it's underwater. Because at the end of the flood, when there were no ice caps, sea level was about 190 meters higher. That's almost 200 meters higher without ice. This is what the extreme environmentalists are worried about today. They're worried about all the ice caps are going to melt and we're all going to flood out a lot of our cities. And that's true. That would happen if it did. This is what you'd get. So how do you go from where that star is, where the arc lands, somewhere near Turkey, and get animals to North America? Big animals, elephants, like animals, mastodons and mammoths that we see in the Ice Age. South America as well, all around the world. How do you get these animals all over the place? If the water is even higher than it is today by over 190 meters. So you started building up ice and lowering sea level, there was almost no way to get there unless you floated across. I know it's a lame cartoon. I don't want to belittle the idea, But rafting across has been suggested in maps. But how do you raft big animals like elephants and camels? Why would they go onto a log mat, or predators? Why would they go on a log mat and then float across the ocean, which might have taken 6 weeks or more, even in the best currents, to get across the ocean? Even if there was a lot of debris, which I believe there probably was, but I don't think a lot of hoofed animals particularly are going to stand on logs. And then you got to figure out, what are they going to eat? What are they going to drink while they're out there? Where's their freshwater source? And what sort of plants are they going to eat? What's going to attract them to do this? And then you have to have males and females along for the same ride everywhere you go. It doesn't do any good to have a male camel go one way and a female the other. So I think we need to think through the dispersal after the flood. If you believe the KPG is the end of the flood, you need to explain, better than what's been published. There's been a few, like Mike Ord's put forth here, of animals kind of moving around, but I find that difficult to, in reality, it's a difficult thing to do, I think, with especially the bigger animals. Small ones, maybe, but the big ones, very difficult. And I think, the idea of the KPG as the end of the flood belittles, I believe, the purpose of the Ice Age. That's my number 10, is what's the purpose of the Ice Age? If not to create temporary land bridges. So if you don't have your land bridges, that's how you were able to walk from Asia to North America or across the Bering Sea. Because in this case, all that brown is dry land during the maximum Ice Age. So there's enough water sucked out of the oceans, drop sea level, so that you could walk to almost every continent. The only one you still couldn't walk to quite was Australia. So a little bit of a gap between some of the islands. So you couldn't physically walk to Australia without a little bit of swimming. And that may be why some of the animals in Australia are preserved. You don't have lions and tigers and bears that got across to Australia. And so you have some animals in Australia that were able to survive till today that are different than anywhere else. All of those animals, even the Australian ones, had to come from the Ark. They had to cross to Asia. They had to get to Australia. They had to walk across that way and possibly swim a little bit of distance. So everything had to come from the Ark. And to me, the purpose of the Ice Age, which was set up by the creation of new seafloor, making the oceans hot by all that hot lava, and all the volcanoes that were peaking in the Zuni, and after during the Tejas and during the Cenozoic, and even during the Ice Age, all those volcanoes, the subduction zone volcanoes particularly, that have the very explosive chemistry that you need by subducting a slab down and distilling the ocean crust, making these very granitic-rich magmas that are explosive to cool the earth by putting up aerosols for hundreds of years afterwards. Not only does the plate tectonics explain that, but it also then causes an ice age, one ice age after the flood, to lower sea level, because I believe God had a plan all along to repopulate the earth through these land bridges. It's very difficult to do until you have the land bridges going. And this is a secular map, which to me is pretty amazing. Again, the dates are wrong here, but to me, the purpose of the Ice Age was to lower sea level. Just like a sponge, suck up enough water all around the world after the flood within the first couple hundred years, start to bring on an Ice Age. And that Ice Age maybe lasted, as Mike Ord and others have estimated, 500 to 700 years. So you had a window of time when you could walk across from Europe to England. You could walk across Europe to Ireland. You could walk across from Asia to North America, all the way to South America, to Africa. Everything. This, again, I couldn't have drawn a better set of arrows. It's almost perfect from the dispersal to Tower of Babel here. So I'm amazed that the secular conventional scientists get it right, but they have the years wrong. But that's the basic idea. During the Ice Age, all this could happen. Prior to the Ice Age, it's very difficult because you have to sail across major waterways, huge oceans. You have to somehow float across these rafts and drift across over weeks of time without water, possibly, unless you're relying on rainwater to come down. These rafts are going to be very porous. They're not going to hold water. And then one other thing I want to mention, we're almost done here, so hang in there, folks. Also, this is maybe not brought up enough, and maybe I don't emphasize it enough, but about 80% of the world's mountains all formed after the KPG. 80% of the world's mountains formed after the KPG. Some of them might have been beginning a little bit earlier, but yeah, this has to do with I believe the plate tectonics and the disruptions to the mantle that were taking place. And this actually happened before the plates were done moving. We saw there was still half the world's ocean was still made, still subducting actively, making enough to make half the world's oceans after the KPG. So here we are, what the evolutionists would call 50 million years ago, the Middle Eocene. To me, this is 4,400, 4,500 years ago during the flood. This is part of the receding phase of the flood. But here's where the mountains, all those dark brown areas are where the mountains are coming up. The Rockies, the Andes, the Alps, a lot of the Himalayas. Again, India hadn't even collided with Asia yet until, even at this point, it still hadn't collided. It's getting close. And so the Himalayas weren't even what they are today. All these mountains all formed. The only ones that formed during the flood earlier were like things like the Urals and the Appalachians. But how do you have tens of thousands of feet of offset of rocks going up and down if you got people and animals trying to walk around the earth and float across from one continent to another? To me, this screams that the flood wasn't over. Too much tectonic activity. For example, here's the Grand Tetons. Grand Teton Fault shows about 26,000 feet of offset. They show recent sediments there, but that's geologically recent in the evolutionist worldview. The sandstones, the Cambrian sandstones at the bottom, below that area, it says recent sediments. And the top of the Grand Tetons is about 26,000 feet of vertical relief. And this happened really late. This is one of the youngest of the Rocky Mountains. It happened in the Miocene-Pliocene, right towards the end of what I believe was the receding phase of the flood. So here you have 26,000 feet of movement. How can animals live through this? How could humans live through this? These earthquakes would have been just unfathomably large. Still going on until about the time of just before the Ice Age. And finally, I think I have two more. Many angiosperms or the dicots show up above the KPG. Joseph Hooker, director of Kew, to whom Darwin wrote in 1879, said, "The rapid development, as far as we can judge, of all the higher plants within recent geological times is an abominable mystery." And so Darwin couldn't explain how plants could evolve because he was trying to use natural selection as part of the problem. But animals can adapt, as we're seeing at ICR, because it's internal. God built it inside them. But you can't make up whole new types of plants like angiosperms. And here's a graph. He said, certainly would be a great step in mystery. It's an abominable mystery if we could believe the higher plants at first could live only at higher level. But until it's experimentally proven, then he goes on to say that maybe these animals did live at higher elevations. And I believe they did in the pre-flood world. This is the plants, the angiosperms. And you can see I drew the red line there. Everything to the right of that, anything that shows up is part of the Cenozoic. And so the flowering plants, there were a few that showed up earlier before the KPG. But again, the bulk of them, at least half of them, show up after the KPG. So how did these plants just suddenly show up? Did they rapidly evolve after the flood too? And that's, how did these things do this? And so there's a big problem with all the mammals we see in the Cenozoic, all the plants we see for the first time in the Cenozoic. To me, that's a big warning sign that the flood might not have been over. And so I believe, and I showed the world map earlier, that like in North America, that Canada was probably the pre-flood uplands. Everything thins towards Canada. There was an area that I called Dinosaur Peninsula, which would have been the lowland areas, which I need to flesh out a little bit better and refine this a little better. But all over the world, we see these same basic environments: shallow seas in blue. The yellow areas are these lowland areas. And then you have these upland areas that were stripped down right to the crust. And those are, everything thins toward those, which tells us that was the highest ground as those sediments are being deposited. So I think those basic environments we can glean out from my research. And I've done that. I'm going to refine that with 6 continents here, hopefully by this year and next, and be able to show a better complete pre-flood world map the way I think it was. And that, to me, that explains the fossil record. The reason you get angiosperms showing up so much is because those weren't flooded until later. That's when the highest hills. The reason you see so many mammals showing up suddenly above where the dinosaurs are, because they lived at higher elevations. And they weren't swept away until after the dinosaurs were completely inundated. Their whole ecosystem was destroyed. So it looks like an extinction to the evolutionists, but it's just the whole ecosystem's gone, plants included. And then you get new plants and new mammals above that. And the dinosaurs are no more. Finally, I threw this in today because this is another extensive deposit. Leonard Brand talked about this last time, these extensive deposits in the Cenozoic rocks. And here's another one that's dated as Pliocene Miocene, so it's near the top of what you call the Tejas, right below the Ice Age fossil. This is the Ogallala Formation, Ogallala Aquifer, it's often called. And it extends from Texas all the way up to South Dakota. It covers 8 different states, 174,000 square miles. This is what's there today. It's been eroded partly, as you can see. It averages about 200 to 300 foot thick, but in some places it's over 1,000. And it's been described in the secular literature as a sheet sand of sand and gravel. So here east of the Rockies, we have this huge massive sheet sand that eroded away from the Rockies, I believe, during the latter parts of the receding phase of the flood, and just deposited the sand right there and actually eroded some of it itself as the water continued to recede away. But there's almost no other conceivable way to deposit a sand this extensive across that big of an area unless you're still underwater of the flood. So the water has been receding, it's been draining down to the Gulf of Mexico, but you're still leaving extensive deposits across North America. And this is one of the most extensive Cenozoic sands. This is a sheet sand. This is a blanket sand, just like we talk about the Tapete sandstone. Here it is in the Miocene and Pliocene. If this was deposited by streams, like the evolutionists say, you would expect to see a lot of stream channels surrounded by lots of clay, but you don't see that. You just see sand deposits, just like Leonard Brand talked about a few weeks ago for some of the Cenozoic deposits he was looking at. And so to me, the most logical explanation for this is it's part of the flood. So you add all these up and you get at least 13 things I talked about, but some of these things are very, very powerful. I think the KPG is too low in the flood record for the end of the flood. The higher, high KPG, or the high Cenozoic boundary, or the NQ boundary as I call it, explains the massive amount of marine and Tejas sedimentation across the Middle East, across North Africa, across much of Europe. All those areas were still underwater. You still have marine sedimentation all the way up from the Cretaceous, continually all the way up through the top of the Miocene and Pliocene, which is top of the Cenozoic, right below the Ice Age. And then it explains the Whopper Sand. How do you get over 1,000-foot thick sand? In some places, almost 2,000 foot thick, that covers most of the deep part of Gulf of Mexico. How do you get the coal beds offshore? How do you get the coal beds onshore? They're that thick and that extensive, like we see, not just in the United States, but all over the world. South America, some of the most extensive coal seams are in the Cenozoic. In Europe, some of the most extensive lignite deposits, coal deposits, are in the Cenozoic. Massive amounts of coal covering huge areas that are best explained by the flood's activity. And one of the strongest evidences, and John Baumgartner has pointed this out for 30 years, is the creation of over half the ocean's seafloor. The flood mechanism itself, the mechanism that was driving the flood, was still only halfway done by the time you get to the KPG. You still made over half the ocean crust after the KPG. So to me, to stop and say the flood was over and you still have massive amounts of ocean crust being formed, runaway subduction still going on, no indication it can slow it down. John Baumgartner talked about this in his presentations. He says you can't stop it. It goes until it's done, until it runs out of gasoline, runs out of fuel, which is the cold original ocean crust. Once that original cold ocean crust was gone, the density difference was gone, everything stops. You can't stop midway. It has to continue to its completion. And it was only halfway done at the KPG. And finally, the first appearance of so many mammals, large mammals, elephants, camels, horses, all these things all show up after, and whales, marine mammals, all show up after the KPG. They're not in, they should be in the flood rocks too, if that's all part of the flood, before the KPG, but they're not. They show up after the KPG, so I believe these are part of the flood as well, and including the flowering plants. Many of the flowering plants show up in the Cenozoic for the first time. So it's the first appearances of these things is what's surprising. That's the evidence. So to me, you got to go back and think, okay, there's no perfect solution, whether you're a KPG person or you're an NQ person like me. There's nothing perfect, but you got to look at the strength of the data. You got to look at the rocks. To me, it's the ocean floor and the very mechanism of the flood that John Baumgartner gave us through this runaway subduction, this whole process of catastrophic plate tectonics that we all use. Most of us, there's a few of you that are still questioning it, but most of us, whether you're a KPG person or not, you accept CPT. How do you justify half the ocean crust is still being formed? India hadn't even collided with Asia. Most of the mountains didn't even form. Tens of thousands of feet of uplift are going on after the KPG all over the world and all these major mountain ranges. How do you float your animals over to these places when the Ice Age hadn't begun yet? There's all these questions that are best answered by a high flood boundary. And again, in the middle there, I have the marine rocks, the salts and the sands and the limestones being deposited all around the Middle East, all the way southern across Europe and Syria, Iraq, North Africa, that whole region. The rocks reflect it was still underwater, and that's where the Ark lands. That's where you tried to build the Tower of Babel. How do you build Tower of Babel when it's still underwater? How do you land the Ark when it's get off the arc when it's still underwater. To me, there's too much sedimentation in the Tejas globally. Over 31.7% of the 6 sequences. That 6 sequence has 31.7% of the volume, and is the second only in surface coverage to the Zuni. To me, all these things add up. Major global events. Again, to me, I can almost drop the mic when I talked about the seafloor. That's what John Baumgartner's been saying for years. Too much seafloor is being made, but the seafloor matches exactly with what I'm seeing in terms of it's pushing the waves onto the continents, and it's showing that it's a progressive flood, just like you'd expect. If you have progressively more seafloor, you're going to get a progressive flood. So we see that perfect match. And so all that indicates that the flood was not over at the KPG. So here's kind of my interpretation with the Bible thrown in. The flood begins down here day 1, whether it's part of the Precambrian, which I believe it probably was. Then you get to the Sauk-Tipic and Kaskaskia. Those were just flooding shallow seas where the sea level didn't rise too high. It kind of got a little higher each time. And then boom, the arc floats. The Bible tells us around day 40. And I believe that might be the beginning of the Upserica. We're now getting coal seams all over the world show up. Land animals in the rock record suddenly show up all over the world in great numbers. But you're always mixing them with marine. There's sharks in the Hell Creek Formation with the T-Rexes and things like that. But the water kept going higher and higher, washing these waves all the way in, higher and higher and higher, till they peaked at about the KPG. So I believe the KPG was the peak of the flood, or thereabouts. And then the Tejas sequence, whether you believe it's the sequence or not, was the receding phase. And so you can argue, well, some of my colleagues have said it's not a real mega sequence. Well, that doesn't matter. If the water's going down, you can argue, well, but if it's not going up, is that a mega sequence? If it's going down, I don't know. But the evolutionary community accepts it as a mega sequence, and there's still major flooding going on during the Tejas. But I believe the water was going down, pushing the Whopper Sand, et cetera, out there. And so that's the end of my talk. I'll just kind of call it quits there, and I'll try to unshare, I guess. But when you add all this up, to me, it's very difficult to explain many of these things we looked at, particularly the seafloor being created. And the seafloor creates and pushes the water higher and higher, pushing sediments higher and higher across the continents. To me, that is the best explanation, that the flood was still going on, to explain the Whopper Sand, these coal seams offshore, these massive deposits of the Ogallala Formation. To me, it's almost unfathomable to say the flood is over. And again, where's the erosion? Where's the erosional activity that should be there at the KPG if that's the end of the flood? We just see layer upon layer, like pancake on pancake, right across the KPG in most places. So there's a lot of things. I know that my paleontological colleagues argue from paleontology up near the top, but I think they often neglect where those animals came from in the first place. Why did they just suddenly show up post KPG? I don't believe they were evolving. I don't believe they were coming from things off the arc that look completely different, and suddenly they show up. I think that was all part of the flood. So I will stop there, and I'll try to answer a few questions. I know I ran a little long, but there was a lot of things to try to cover in one night, and there's things I had to leave out as well. So I think I stopped the share. Do you know how to do this, Zach?
You're good. You can just switch back over to StreamYard if you like. I've taken your screen share off.
Do I just close this?
Yep, you can close that.
Okay.
And we've got a good slate of questions, actually.
Okay.
So some really good ones here. So I've got most of them here queued up, and I'll be watching the chat for any more that come in.
I can
and
see
I'm
them.
just going to go in chronological order here. If you switch over to the starred tab, that's where you're going to see the questions. There you go.
I got to scroll up, though. Are you at the bottom or the top?
I'll start at the top. So we'll kind of go in. People were putting them in during the talk, so we'll kind of go
I know. I was talking pretty fast.
Order.
There's a lot to cover. There's a lot to cover, and trying to explain all these maps is difficult to do, and I apologize to the viewing audience. I tried to do the best I could.
Well, I thought you did fantastic. And
thank you.
Very interesting.
Without an audience, I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Yep, I know. Right, talking to the screen. That's right. Mm-hmm. All right, lots of compliments coming in too in the chat. So the first question is from DVD is the handle. The places where no sediments are. So this is kind of earlier in your talk, some of those sediment extent maps, such as high elevation territory in Peru, where there are giant megalithic structures. Is it possible that these are pre-flood, the structures?
Well, I don't believe so, because I looked at these. People have asked me this before, and it's a great question because they are very unusual. And, like the pyramids are the same way. But I looked at the ones in Peru, and they're not in areas where there's sediments below that, in that area, those megalithic structures actually have thousands of feet of flood sediments below them in most cases. So they're not up in like Canada, for example, sitting on top of the crystalline rock. They're actually areas that are full of flood sediments below them. So I believe those are all post-flood. Everything I've seen in the world, looking at 6 continents, I've only seen things from the flood, but no human structures. Human structures are all post-flood. They're all like the pyramids are built out of flood rocks, on flood rocks, just like those structures in Peru are built out of flood rocks or igneous rocks nearby, but they're built on flood rocks.
All right. And the next question, and I believe you addressed this one in your previous talk for our live stream, but the question is, how long do you think the flood waters rose? Did they rise and peak by day 40, remain till 150, or do you think the flood waters continually rose until day 150?
Yeah, I think I kind of answered that one in my last graph. Maybe he asked this earlier, but I think they rose for about 150 days. I think that if you read the Bible, it sounds, to me and my Hebrew experts here at ICR, that the water rose for 150 days, I believe. And then it peaked, and that's when the ark also grounded itself, and then the water started to go down. The ark was sitting there maybe grounded, but there was still water all around it, I think, but it kind of ran. I think there's a ridge that came up, Kazakh Mountain Ridge, I call it, on one of our articles I wrote at ICR's website about the ark landing spot. And it's about 70 or 80 miles west of Mount Ararat. It's in a ridge that runs east-west. And that went about 8,000 or 10,000 feet above sea level. So if it did land there, I don't think it's high enough to preserve the ark. Dr. John Morris is kind of annoyed with me, but he's a good guy. He's like, well, maybe I was in the wrong place all along. But there's reports of arcs on Mount Ararat, but Mount Ararat is an ice age volcano, and so there's a lot of volcanic activity that took place after the flood. Whether you believe in the KPG or not, as the end of the flood, we all agree that was ice age. So it's difficult, but I do believe it's 150 days of rising, and then the day 314 is when I believe the earth was dry in Genesis 8:13. And then they stayed on the ark for till day 371 before they were allowed to get off, because I believe they had to wait for some vegetation to grow. All the food's on the ark, why get off? And so they had to get off. There's finally enough to eat that God allowed them off the ark.
Awesome. All right. The next question is from Ryan, the Raptor guy. Can you discuss your thoughts on Harry Dickens' position that sea level was highest during the Sauk and Tippecanoe mega sequence?
Yeah, Harry, I like the guy. He's a really sweet guy, and I met him a few times, and I conversed with him back and forth. But I just think he's wrong in this case. I think there's way too much going on, way too many animals. The dinosaurs hadn't even been buried in the flood. There's, the more you look at these rock layers, they're just extensive layers. We see Grand Canyon, we see 277 miles of exposed rocks, but that's nothing. And then you take the oil wells we drilled all the way across the continent. We can see those layers extend all the way over to New York. It's like these layers are continuous. You see the same limestones deposited in the Black Hills making caves as they are in Kentucky, as they are in the Redwall limestone down in Grand Canyon. So these layers are way too extensive, many of them beyond when he says the flood is over. But I love Harry. He's a great Christian guy. We just disagree on that. I think that the data supports. He sometimes relies a little bit too heavily on the secular literature as well, I think. And nobody's done, not to brag my own horn or blow my own horn here, but nobody in my knowledge has done the extensive mapping of geologic columns that I've done, where I look at every major basin, every major uplift all over the world. And if 6 continents are done now, I've just got to do New Zealand and what I can around Antarctica. And that's all we can do at this point until the ice melts. It's to me, we see a clear progressive flood. And that's something we never knew before. Henry Morris wrote about the flood, and he kind of had the same flood boundary I picked, but he didn't understand the mechanism of plate tectonics that wasn't even in existence at the time, let alone catastrophic plate tectonics. And so there's a lot of changes that we need to update. But I know a lot of people, Paul Garner originally held to a lower view as well. And there's others, Ken Colson believes that maybe we should move the flood boundary up, the beginning of the flood. I think I have a better handle on the end of the flood than I do the beginning of the flood, but I think some of the Precambrian was definitely involved in the flood. I don't know about all of it, like some people say, but that's another question for another time. But that's a good question.
Yeah, and maybe just add a little more context to this particular question, because you are revising the conventional sea level curve. Could you maybe contrast the way that secular geologists, like what data are they using to get that curve in the first place, And then kind of how do you revise it? What's your criteria?
A lot of them started out with, Exxon and some of these companies were studying areas where they were looking onshore and then just shallow offshore areas. They're shooting a little bit of seismic. In the 70s, particularly, they were coming up with this idea of, the sequences and the sequence boundaries. And at the bottom of the boundaries, of course, where you get your sand. So they got them all excited economically to look for sands because you always want sands for your reservoir for oil. And if you can get those draped over things. So we did a lot of the smaller sequences. We didn't look at the mega sequences, the big ones as much. There's a lot of individual sequences. Even within a mega sequence, there's a bunch of, thousands and thousands of waterways going back and forth, giving us all these different layers. But I think that they did their work early. They were happy with it. They seemed to look at, some oil wells, some seismic. But since they came up with that idea, they haven't updated anything. They haven't looked at the world's geology. They haven't looked at Europe. They haven't looked at South America. And I presented some of this at a GSA, a Geological Society of America conference a few years ago. And I showed them that we've been lying to our students all these years by saying there's a high sea level in the, Sauk and Tippecanoe, Cambrian Ordovician. And it's based on the preliminary work. And even the guys that study this say that the data that they use for the earlier Paleozoic is much more, it's just a lot less. There's a lot less data to support their views. So they just kind of go with it because that's what they've always said. But when you start looking at the global picture, you see there's very little flooding early on. There's a lot across North America, and I think that's why we show that still. And then it seems to dry out if you follow North America only. So I think, unfortunately, it's almost ethnocentric, or whatever the word is, where we look at only our own little area, what we know. And they've stuck with that since the 70s. And they haven't really updated it since the 70s. They refined the higher level, sea levels, and they try to tie it into all this orbital tuning and all this, fluctuation of the climate. But they haven't really worked on the Paleozoic, that lower part of the geologic column that we believe is the beginning of the flood. And so I think my data, again, not to blow my own horn, is actually better and more accurate. Even though mine is a diagrammatic curve, I don't try to put hundreds of meters of water level like they do. Mine just kind of shows what I see the rocks show. That's what I drew. And you see very little flooding in those first three sequences, and all of a sudden, boom, it jumps way up. And you see it all over the world. You see the Karua sandstone, for example, deposited across Africa suddenly. And there was almost no coverage in Africa until that fourth sequence, the Upserica sequence. And you see that all over the world. But it's, when you look at all the world and look at it all at once in this database we're building, you really do see a progressive flood. And the best explanation for a progressive flood is a progressive production of seafloor, pushing the water higher and higher and higher. And that's, to me, why it's difficult to stop at the KPG and say, oh, it's over. I know there's, people that, like my friend Marcus Ross and others, they have some statistical arguments for it at the end of the flood. But, I still want to know where these animals came from above the KPG, why they suddenly show up. It's hard to get, where they came from. It isn't just where they go away. It's you got to also address where they came from. But there's, but to me, no critic of the higher flood boundary has really addressed the geophysics of the ocean that John Baumgartner has been pointing out for over 30 years. He told me before, he said, they don't listen to me, Tim. I said, well, we're all that way. We all have our minds made up. And we're not going to convince people that have their minds made up of any change. And that's the way it is all in science, whether you're a revolutionist or a creationist. Sometimes we have to go back and look, okay, what does the data really show? And I tried to do that. I was a KPG person too, 10 years ago. But to me, there's too much data. And there's too much seafloor. And there's all these other things I talked about tonight that really, to me, shows the flood boundary, I think, is a lot higher. But again, there's debate on everything. We're looking at historical science. We have the biblical record, and we have what we can find in the rocks. But the more rocks you look at, I think the better picture you get of it. And I think I'm getting a better picture of a progressive flood.
Excellent. We got one more question that's kind of still on the same topic, so I'll do that now.
Okay.
And that's from Fred. He asks, during the Permian Triassic, there are red beds, calcretes, etc., things that secular geologists interpret as evidence of a drying environment, and that would relate to our seafloor discussion or sea level discussion. So how is this evidence explained in your model?
Well, part of that is, they do what, John Whitmore has done some wonderful research on the Permian Coconino sandstone, and he's tied those into the sandstones, like the 10-slip sandstone across Wyoming, all this whole area, huge, massive deposits of sandstone. Well, those are all supposed to be dry, arid sand dunes. We get red you get red sandstones throughout the rock record, it's not a big deal. You just have to have oxidized, iron, etc. It doesn't mean it was drying out. You get gypsum throughout the rock record. I'm mapping out gypsum and salt deposits. You got salt deposits, in the Precambrian pouring out off Saudi Arabia, and which the Himalayan sea salts are all part of it. Again, put those back together, they fit the best in a Pangea mode. But just because you have red beds, to me, doesn't indicate that it was drying out, or even gypsum. You have a lot of dehydration going on, a lot of strange waters coming out from the crust all over, spewing these salt deposits and spewing these hydrothermal gypsum deposits and things. But again, it's the secular idea that the Coconino was a dry arid sand dune, so therefore it must be dry. And that's one of the reasons why they stick to that drop in sea level. It's because they see a lot of these sandstones, these huge sandstones, all show up in the Upserica. The Coconino is part of the Upserica. You don't see these huge cross-bedded sandstones until then. That's when you're starting to push the material across the continents. That's why you see them all over the world at about the same time. The Permian, Pennsylvanian sandstones are the first massive cross-bedded sands. And you see them in the Jurassic. You see them in Navajo and different things. You see those massive sandstone beds that the evolutionists just like, oh, no, these can't be water waves. That's too big. So they have to insist that these are dry, arid sand dunes. So that's part of the reason why their curve drops as well. But again, a lot of it's based in North America.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a good question, because there's, that's one of the things, Harry Dickens points out, that, and he goes with that. And there's, there's some argument to that, but again, it's their interpretation. John Whitmer showed, I think, conclusively that the Coconino is a, as he calls a subaqueous, or a water deposit, a marine deposit. It's got too much dolomite ooids in it and things like that they found. When you look at the details, again, the details are what really helps us. There's a lot of details you can look at, and to me, that shows that this was not a drying period at all. This was still part of the flood, part of the advancing, actually getting a little higher water levels, as my data is showing.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of those formations could bear reanalysis, similar to the Coconino.
There's a lot of work. I mean, it's just, we gloss over stuff thinking we got it all figured out because we want to try to act like we have it figured out. And then the next thing you're looking at it and you're like, I was wrong. Sometimes we got to just admit sometimes we were wrong and move on. I mean, if you guys, to me, that's why I changed my view of the KPG and moved it up. And I know Paul Garner's moved his up to the KPG from an earlier one as well. But eventually everybody's got to weigh the data themselves. And that was my final argument was, what do you want to consider is the strongest data? And I believe the global ocean crust is tremendously powerful, because that ties exactly to what I see in the progressive flood on the continents. And there's a one-in-one match, more seafloor, more flooding. And that's what we see. To me, that's a global thing. And to end the flood before that's done is to me, you're stopping. The mechanism is still going on of the flood. And so to me, it's difficult to stop it there.
The engine's still running. Mm-hmm. Are you good for a few more questions?
Sure, I can go a little longer.
All right. Let's see if we can get through a few more.
I'm at Central Time.
I know, right? That same here. Yeah, so it's not a big deal for me.
They're going
for
to bed.
Our East Coast friends. You might need to tune into the recording later. All right. So another question from Ryan. Could you comment on why marine life forms in the various Paleozoic and Mesozoic systems are not mixed together? And I think by that he means we have segregated strata with different fossils. And then the question is, did they live in different geographically segregated places before the flood?
I think the latter might be a possibility. That's the question. I don't know if I can address that. I wonder about that myself. A guy challenged me on that a long time ago when I first started doing this. He goes, well, how come the Cambrian marine fossils are different than the Ordovician marine fossils? And that's why they can segregate these out. But there's overlap in some of these as well. A lot of them are just differences and minor differences, but there's some major changes. And I think it is partly due to the water going a little bit higher and maybe bringing in things, washing things a little further in. But I think the Earth might have been a little more stratified in the pre-flood world, even the oceans, than we think today. We're always thinking like what the world's like today, and it's hard to project back. But I think there's a lot of work, a lot of paleontology work that needs to be done to really flesh out why we see these differences. We can't just look at the paleobiology database and crank up, okay, what do we see? We need to actually start looking at these columns and look at the fossils in these columns, in a smaller scale than I'm working on, but look at just maybe North America, start up, part of North America and look at the fossils. Why do we see differences and do cross sections, strat sections across, even in the Paleozoic only? and start looking at that type of thing and see why do these fossils change here, why this are different other places as well. But I don't know. That's I'm not afraid to say that I don't know the answer to that, but I've thought about it. But I think there's got to be more stratification to the even the waterways in the pre-flood world than maybe we give credit for.
Yeah, present is not the key to the past, right? So
exactly.
Think creatively sometimes. We got another question from Fred. Discuss when mountain building occurred during the flood. I think you kind of addressed that towards the end. But
a little bit, yeah.
The other question is, when mountain ranges rose up, would they have trapped marine waters in basins?
I believe they would. I mean, I think that's part of the reason why we see across the Wyoming province, they call it, we see all these major uplifts popping up, and most of these began maybe around the Cretaceous. You want to argue that, but most of it happened after the KPG. Most of the mountain building, the Rockies, the Andes, 80% of the world's mountains all pop up late, as I believe the water is receding. But you're going to trap individual waterways. But if you look at Wyoming, all the basins are all capped with Eocene. They're all capped at the same rock layer level. They can map it out as these are all kind of Eocene rocks. So the Green River, the Powder River, the Wind River, the Bighorn Basin. There's differences in lithology, differences in some of the fish, particularly the Green River Formation is very unique. But most of the Green River is limestone. I believe that there's a lot more marine influence there than we've been given it credit for, and I think that's another thing that needs to be studied. But we can't just look at that. We got to look at the bigger picture. That all these basins are filled to the brim with Eocene at the top. Why is that? Yeah. There's some sort of common solution to them. But they were popping up and they were causing the water in between to be kind of trapped like in a bowl. So you do see some uniqueness, but yet you see a common level that was happening as well. And so these mountains are coming up, these basins were sinking nearby. Exactly how that all happened is even the evolutionists don't have a good explanation for it.
It's a very complicated region.
That much movement going up and down is it has to be the effects that was happening in the mantle during the flood year. But exactly how, again, we got years and years and years of things that we can study. We can there's plenty of room for you young kids out there to come and study geology. We really need people to go into geophysics. Less people go into geophysics. I've had a lot of geophysics. I did a lot of geophysics for the oil company. I was fortunate in that regard. The guy prepared me for the things that I'm doing by working for the oil company. I feel grateful that I was able to experience that because it helps me to do the research I'm doing. But we all have different paths. He has a plan for all of us. It's Jesus. Jesus has a plan. Whether you're following it or not. In my case, he sometimes throws you off the boat. And I got laid off, or I wouldn't have got a PhD. And there's things that happen in my life that I would do differently. Many people I would think that way. Where I swayed away from the path that God wanted me on, but he brought me back. You get chastised sometimes, but he brings you back. And I think I'm finally doing what he had planned for me to do all along. And so I really appreciate the time at ICR and to work in creation science and to meet so many wonderful, Bible believing, people that know that Jesus is the reason for it all. And we can disagree all we want, but we agree that Jesus is our Savior. And that's really what it's all about. But science is just a lot of fun, and it's really great when it shows, confirming God's word, that God's word is true. To me, that's the goal of science, is to confirm God's word and to understand more of how He not only created it, but how the judgment of the flood really changed the world, and then we can sort out a little bit more about what the pre-flood world was like. To me, it's just fascinating to be working in geology.
Absolutely, faith-seeking knowledge, right? All right, here's one that I slipped in. It's kind of relevant to some recent discussion that I'm sure you're familiar with, and that is what is your thought on the clay consolidation problem that was recently published in the Quarterly? And then related to that, when do you think sediments largely dewatered, in your view? When did they kind of consolidate?
That's a good question. We published that because I got reviewed and people said, yeah, let it go. But in the next CRSQ, there's going to be a letter that one of our readers wrote, and I put a little editor's note at the top that said, even though this, follows kind of uniformitarian principles, it's a problem that maybe we need to address. But we still believe in a young Earth, and all these clays can be consolidated somehow very, very rapidly. I do see evidence of that. You go to the Badlands, for example, in South Dakota, you see clastic dikes where the sand shot out and the water shot out along fractures. It was compacting so fast that it was causing the water to compress in these layers and shoot out, and some of these cause thrust faults, over thrust faults to form. You get layers where you're packing down. When you pile a lot of sediment, Professor Dunn, when he did his study, he didn't. I don't think he compiled that much. Thousands of feet of sedimentation coming down over the course of just months of time, and that weight of all that material is going to push it all down. It's going to push it all down. See, the cleaning people are here, but there's a lot of things where it can happen under special conditions, and I think he wasn't thinking it along that line. He was thinking more uniformitarian style compaction. So I think there's, someone needs to study this more. Some sedimentologists, for example, I think easily it can happen. There is evidence all over the earth of these, clastic dikes and dewatering structures, even some of these things that they call. There's evidence in the limestones, these stylites and things like that, rapid, compressive, where you have dissolution and stuff happening because of compaction. So there's a lot of clays can compact about 50%. So there's a lot of room for compaction. They're filled with a lot of water, and so as they get piled down with heavier materials and rocks, I think they can compact pretty quick, much more quickly than he gave it credit for. But we put that out there. There'll be a little note in the next one, a little caveat that I didn't need to imply that the Earth's got to be millions of years old or anything to compact the clays. I think there's a way to do it. We just need maybe someone to come up with a model and explain it a little bit better.
And that's what Dunn was doing, right? He was showing here's the numbers we have, and this is what it seems like it would take, and maybe we need new numbers. That's the challenge.
And people talk about these problems like the heat problem and all this stuff. There's just quick back of the envelope calculations. You can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater just because you did a simple math equation and saying, oh, there's too much heat, can't do it. So plate tectonics couldn't happen. There's too much evidence that it did to do something like that. So this is the same sort of thing. A simple little quick, oh, gotcha. You can't do that. There's too much evidence that these things really did happen in a short amount of time, and just the Bible talks about that almost the geology that that we see all happened in the flood. And to me, it's amazing what did happen. That God really did destroy the entire earth, and we really did start over.
All right, just a couple more here. We have another question from Nate. What evidence do we have that there was only 200 years from the flood to the ice age?
Well, again,
Nate knows what he's doing.
Well, that's what Larry Vardaman, that's what Mike Orr, these guys are meteorology majors. Right. They're the ones that have studied this and mapped it. They're the ones that show. And Kurt Weiss, he admits that, there's about 100 to 200 years, maybe 300 years at the most, but most people say 100 to 200 years before you really had a full-blown ice age. You can't wait. Once you get those hot oceans, they're going to start pumping up evaporation. And you got the volcanoes that are going off since the, this into the Mesozoic. You started really cranking out volcanoes, cooling the Earth's atmosphere. So it's going to come down to snow right away. And so there's no delay because the oceans are so hot, and there's no delay. You got all this evaporation coming down as snow in the north because the volcanoes are already going off. And so there is no chance to hold it off for 500 years and say, no, wait. Now it's going to start. You've only got about 100, 200 years. And in any reasonable estimate, it's because the oceans are already too hot, and already too much evaporation coming down, and too much snow coming down because we've already cooled the earth because there's already too many volcanoes that are putting up aerosols. And so I don't think you can really stretch that out. And even, my colleague Kurt Weiss, some of his talks, he admits that there's only about 100 to 200 years. So if you believe the Cenozoic is post-flood, you've got 1 to 200 years for all that to be deposited. Because you have ice age things that happen. Even in Grand Canyon, you got those 150 lava flows that came down that are ice age in thereabouts. And so you already have to have the canyon there even before those were deposited, type of thing. So there's a small window of time for all this stuff to kind of really happen.
The initial conditions are all kind of right there at the end of the flood.
And so you can't change the initial conditions. Again, those are set up by the plate tectonics, but because you heat the ocean by making a new seafloor out of lava. And so they're there, and so you can't stall them and wait 50, 100 years and then start to bring the snow down. The snow's going to come right away.
Okay, one more from me, actually, and this is related to the coal question. Could offshore coal seams be deposited from flood vegetation, but vegetation mats, but they might still be floating and being deposited after the flood? Like, how would you
Yeah,
distinguish that?
you can argue there's going to be mats. There's going to be like Mount St. Helens. You see these floating logs still there for
Right.
a long time, but they don't sink in mass.
Hmm.
You got to sink a big pile of them, and they're often stacked. Area in the South China Sea, there's like a 3,000 meter layer that's 3,000 meters down below the ocean, and it's got coal, a lot of coal seams in there. They're all stacked. So to me, it's hard to imagine a massive amount of vegetation dropping out, and then wait a little bit of time, and then another massive amount of vegetation drops out. You think it would all drop out at once or drop out slowly a little bit here and there. But we see, to me, and the coals they're all well sorted by, the same types of plants. And so I believe it's from the higher elevations that we're washing offshore.
Right.
As the floodwaters are receding. But there were obviously lots of floating material after the flood, probably a lot of dead bodies of all types. But yeah, I don't think those would have been thick enough for animals, especially big animals, to climb on it and float across without food and water supplies. To me, that's an issue that if you want to end the KPG, the flood, then how do you get the mastodons and the mammoths over there for the ice age? Because the water level is even going to be higher until the ice age, and then, or even the ones before that. The ones particularly in the Cenozoic, these huge animals the size of rhinos and elephants that we see in the American West. How those animals get there? Almost they floated across, but I think they're part of the flood.
All right, you got it in here for one more?
Sure.
All right.
We'll do one more.
This is the big one, right? So there was that energetic ICC paper just last summer, and this question is related to that. So what do you think about Dr. Kurt Wise's biostratigraphy paper, where he argues that there are no biodiversity breaks in the Cenozoic that would reflect the flood rock to post-flood rock transition? That's from Brian again.
Okay, no biodiversity breaks. Well, I was at his talk, and I'm trying to remember exactly what I said. I wanted to read his paper again, his written out paper. But I think that, part of that's how he sampled. And again, you're looking at just the paleobiology database, and you're looking at, okay, I'm going to do these little increments of the geologic column, and some of that could be aliasing due to his the way he sampled things. And I'm not really sure. I don't think that's a good way to pick the flood boundary. Disagree with Kurt on that one. To say there's no biodiversity breaks in the Cenozoic, I didn't really see that when he was presenting the data myself. But he already had that preconceived conclusion, and so he sees it in the data. But I don't think it's that strong of data. And I would put that on one of the minor evidences for the KPG. It's not a very strong piece of evidence. I think it's kind of, you're playing a little bit of statistical games in a little bit regard. But I understand the effort. Why but to me it's not very strong. Not a very strong argument.
All right. Well, that's it. You handled the whole question queue pretty much. There were a couple little ones in there, but I felt that they were related to other things. I think.
You did well. That was good. I don't mind. It always makes a long night out of these things. But
yep, I know. But I figured we don't get the chances like this that often.
No, it was good. I mean,
go ahead and take them on.
It's good because there's a lot of questions. I mean, I don't have all the answers by any means, but I think you got to consider the strength of the data. I think the stuff that Kurt did is not that strong compared to the seafloor, the whole ocean floor and the ages of that, and the way that shows the progressive flood and the data that I'm seeing. It's a perfect one-to-one match. More seafloor, more flooding, and the continents eventually disappeared. They were gone, and I think that was around the end of the Cretaceous or the KPG. But then the water had to recede after that, and I think that's why we see the Ogallala and all these huge formations and coal seams offshore. To me, it's best explained by the flood boundary being higher. But again, it's the geophysical evidence that John Baumgartner has been telling us about for 30 years that I think is, that's something that needs to be addressed. So, and I appreciate you guys complimenting me.
Yeah.
Say hi to Nate and everybody, and
a lot of kudos coming through.
Questions in, whether you agree with me or not, you're my Christian brothers and sisters, and so we do try to get along as best we can, and even if we do disagree, and sometimes it gets a little heated, but in the end of the day, we got to be able to go to dinner together. And
that's right. Well said.
It's always there was a secular guy we argued about in Wyoming research I did years ago on the South Fork Fault, where I said it was a catastrophic movement, and he said no, it's really, really slow, and we argued back and forth in front of a big audience, and at the end of the day we went out to dinner, and they were like, wow, you guys can go out to eat, and you still well, we're not mortal enemies just because we disagree. Right. You know, even though he wasn't a Christian, but we still, you got to be cordial as best you can. But sometimes, right. You got to get your points across. I understand on both sides.
Right. Well stated. Thank you. And thank you again for the presentation. That was fascinating.
You're welcome. I was glad. Appreciate you guys asked me. Again, I encourage you to get Dr. Glues on here. He has a controversial stuff as well.
Right.
It's controversial.
We might as well, right? We're getting all into the thick of it now, and I believe he is on the queue.
That's cool. We got to talk about this stuff that people have, especially in the creation world, have the biggest disagreements on. It's nice to, let's hear what he has to say. Let's hear what they have to say. Let's hear both sides. Marcus Ross and those guys and Kurt Weiss.
Yep.
They disagree with my position, but and I understand why. But again, I argue that you got to look at the global data, the strength of the data. There's some of the arguments are stronger than others. Some of mine are stronger than others, but you got to look at the whole thing as best you can. And there's no simple answer to any of them. So
right.
But I think we're coming up with some really cool stuff. That's why I wanted to start with that at the beginning. That ICR, as the director of research, I felt obligated to plug a little bit about our new biological theory we're coming up with, where non-random mutations seem to be the name of the game. It's non-random versus random. So
exciting.
Pretty cool. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Zach.
Absolutely.
I'll stick around. I'll stick around for my door prize later.
That's right. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and bring things to an end. I know we went quite a bit over time, but thank you to Dr. Clarey for his patience and for answering so many good questions. Thank you to the audience for all the excellent participation. I don't have the information on next month's presentation up here, so I'm going to ask folks to head over to the website, logosresearchassociates.org. You can also visit our Facebook page if you'd like that. Go ahead and you can get subscribed, and you'll be notified when we do have the details for the April presentation. We're still waiting on getting some things finalized there. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up with a brief word of prayer. So if you'd all like to join me, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this chance we've had to listen and learn. We thank you for Dr. Clarey and for the work that he's been able to accomplish, and for the opportunities you've given him through his career and his time at now at ICR. We thank you just for the wonder of your creation, and that you've made it to be not maybe immediately understandable. It takes some hard work, Lord, but you have given us tools and wisdom and the ability to go out and look at your world and come to an understanding of it based on your word. And we thank you for those like Dr. Clarey and others who have been mentioned who are doing that. And I pray that you would just continue to bless their efforts. Pray that you bless each one that tuned in this evening. And we pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all. We will see you next month.